Chapter 9 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 9. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 9, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 9. The Jaquess Gilmore Mission. If the result of Mr. Greeley's Niagara efforts left any doubt that peace was at present unattainable, the fact was demonstrated beyond question by the result and published report of another unofficial and volunteer negotiation which was proceeding at the same time. The war had brought into the Western Army James F. Jaquess, D.D., a Methodist clergyman from the state of Illinois, whom Governor Yates had commissioned to raise and lead to the field the 73rd Regiment of Illinois Volunteers. With some force of character and practical talent, his piety and religious enthusiasm touched that point of development which causes men to be classed as fanatics or prophets, as success or failure waits on the unusual efforts to which they sometimes dedicate themselves. In May 1863, Colonel Jaquess wrote to General James A. Garfield, then Chief of Staff to General Rosecrans, in whose army Jaquess was serving, as follows. It is a well-known fact that the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States was divided on the very questions which have divided the nation before the Southern states seceded. It is also known that the Methodist Episcopal Church South was a leading element in the rebellion of the Southern states, and has been a prominent power in the prosecution of the war. A considerable part of the territory occupied by the Methodist Episcopal Church South at the time of the separation and up to recent date is now in the possession of the Union, Army. This brings a large number of ministers and people of that communion within our lines. Some of these were prominent in the rebellion that separated the church, and were most bitter and uncompromising on the questions of difference. From these I have learned in person the following facts. That they consider the rebellion has killed the Methodist Episcopal Church South, that it has virtually obliterated slavery, and all the prominent questions of difference between the North and the South, that they are desirous of returning to the old church, Methodist Episcopal, that their brethren of the South are most heartily tired of the rebellion, and that they most ardently desire peace, and the privilege of returning to their allegiance to church and state, and that they will do this on the first offer coming from a reliable source. My attention has been called to these facts and others of a like character frequently of late, and from these considerations, but not from these alone, but because God has laid the duty upon me, I submit to the proper authorities the following proposition, viz. I will go into the Southern Confederacy and return within 90 days with terms of peace that the government will accept. N.B. I propose no compromise with traitors, but their immediate return to allegiance to God and their country. It is no part of my business to discuss the probability or the possibility of the accomplishment of this work. I propose to do it in the name of the Lord. If he puts it into the hearts of my superiors to allow me to do it, I shall be thankful. If not, I have discharged my duty. General Rosecrans forwarded this letter to President Lincoln, earnestly approving and seconding the application of Colonel Jaquess. I do not anticipate the results that he seems to expect, he wrote, but believe a moral force will be generated by his mission that will more than compensate us for his temporary absence from his regiment. To the request thus endorsed, Mr. Lincoln made the following reply. I have but a slight personal acquaintance with Colonel Jaquess, though I know him very well by character. Such a mission as he proposes, I think promises good, if it were free from difficulties, which I fear it cannot be. First, he cannot go with any government authority whatever. That is absolute and imperative. Secondly, if he goes without authority, he takes a great deal of personal risk. He may be condemned and executed as a spy. If for any reason you think fit to give Colonel Jaquess a furlough, and any authority from me for that object is necessary, you hereby have it for any length of time you see fit. General Rosecrans issued the required furlough, but Colonel Jaquess soon found that this alone would not serve his purpose. Instead of trusting to church influence, he at once addressed himself to the ordinary military channels for communicating with the South. He went to Baltimore and asked permission to go by way of Fort Monroe to Richmond. Under date of July 13th, General Schenck telegraphed to the President, "Colonel James F. Jaquess, 73rd Illinois Infantry, is here from the Army of the Cumberland. He desires me to send him to Fort Monroe. Shall I do so? He says you understand." To this Mr. Lincoln replied, "Mr. Jaquess is a very worthy gentleman, but I can have nothing to do, directly or indirectly, with the matter he has in view." We may suppose that the colonel persuaded General Schenck to send him to Fort Monroe, and that he also prevailed upon the officers conducting exchanges of prisoners to further allow him to proceed from there through the military lines on some pretext. At all events, in 11 days Colonel Jaquess was back in Baltimore, from which place he wrote the President the following absurd letter: "I have obtained valuable information and proposals for peace through the channel I proposed, unofficial, but from men of character and great influence in the South, residents there. Would it be consistent for me to communicate them to you? If so, how? By telegraph, mail, or in person? Latter greatly preferred if thought proper. I am moving strictly private. I await your answer at Barnum's." But Mr. Lincoln did not need any further report from Colonel Jaquess. To his quick eye, this brief letter told all the writer intended to communicate, and much more which his blinded enthusiasm could not comprehend. Admitting that he had actually been within the rebel lines, it was preposterous to suppose that in the brief space of a single week he could have gathered any considerable information concerning public sentiment. And the vague intimations of half a dozen private individuals in Richmond were worthless as exponents of the political will of the States in rebellion. Of what value were these unavowed, unofficial suggestions when Lee's army, directed by the unyielding military dictatorship of Jefferson Davis, had with difficulty just been driven out of Pennsylvania, and was still hovering between Washington and Richmond? Mr. Lincoln could listen to none but official proposals, and not to official proposals merely, but to such only as came by and with an authority that can control the armies now at war against the United States, as he stated a year later in his announcement, "to whom it may concern," which is quoted elsewhere. He had just refused to permit the Vice President of the Confederacy to come within the Union lines because he would not avow the object of his visit. All these things were simply a part of the continually repeated diplomatic ruse to get from the government an acknowledgment of the official and independent status of the Confederacy, wherewith to strengthen their claims to European recognition. While combating the open contumacy of the Vallandigham Democrats in Ohio and suppressing the draft riots in New York, the President could not make himself a party to the well-meant but dangerous petty intrigue. Colonel Jaquess was left strictly to his own course, and after waiting at Baltimore till his patience was exhausted, he returned to his regiment in the West, to do better service as a soldier than as a diplomat, meanwhile nursing his hobby for a more opportune occasion, and apparently not communicating to Generals Rosecrans and Garfield, who had honored him with their confidence, the valuable information and unofficial proposals for peace, which, in his note to the President, he claimed to have received. Or, if he did, these officers did not consider them of sufficient importance to bring them to the President's attention. Jaquess's verbal report to some of his personal friends was more rose-colored. He gave out, through the mysterious fellowship and brotherhood of the Church, he had met and conversed with high officers and prominent personages in the rebel armies and Southern society, and had learned from them to his own satisfaction that the South was tired of the war and reconciled to the loss of slavery, but that their sense of general responsibility and loyalty to the rebel cause and government would not permit them to initiate movements for peace, even by intimation. Like all enthusiasts, he was simply strengthened in his zeal by his failure, and about a year afterwards he resolved to repeat his visit and effort. He had, from the first, enlisted the sympathy and aid of J.R. Gilmore, a lecturer and writer under the nom de plume of Edmund Kirk, who had spent much time in the Western armies, to smooth his way through the obstacles of military and official routine. President Lincoln saw clearly enough the futility of all such projected negotiations, but he also understood the necessity of silencing clamors for peace. He therefore again gave Jaquess leave of absence, and to both permission to pass the lines, refusing, however, all authority, instruction, or any promise of protection. He would not even give the colonel a personal interview. In studying this unofficial peace mission as a phenomenon of popular thought, it will not be uninteresting to compare the feeling and theory under which it originated with the feeling and theory under which it submitted its volunteer proposals to the rebel authorities. In his letter to Garfield of May 19, 1863, Colonel Jaquess said, "I propose no compromise with traitors, but their immediate return to allegiance to God and their country." So also Mr. Gilmore, forwarding the application for Colonel Jaquess's second visit, wrote under date of June 15, 1864, "I suppose he, Jaquess, comes to see me to know what terms he can offer those people. Of course, we have none to offer, only to say, lay down your arms and go back to peaceful pursuits. The Emancipation Proclamation tells what we will do for the blacks, the Amnesty Proclamation what we will do for the mass of whites. We can make no terms with rebels." This is, I know, all that you can say, but Jaquess will have to deal with the leaders, and of course they have some affection for their own necks. Suppose I say to him, "Tell the big devils we want no blood. The country feels no enmity and will seek no revenge. It will only seek its own safety. Its safety requires that they no longer remain in it to foster feuds and incite rebellion. Therefore, they must leave. They can sell no lands or houses, no conveyance of that sort will be recognized. But if they need to raise means to pay their passage across the Atlantic by the disposal of their personal property, the government will not interfere with it. But at the end of 60 days, not one of them must be found within the limits of the United States. If they are, the laws made for traitors will be applied for them." At the last moment, Gilmore determined to accompany Jaquess to Richmond. Their short journey was uneventful. On the 16th of July, 1864, at 9 o'clock in the morning, they shook hands with General Butler at one of the Union outposts on the James River, and, trusting to a flag of truce, were lucky enough to find themselves at 10 o'clock that night under close surveillance in one of the rooms of the Spotswood Hotel in the rebel capital. Next morning, Sunday, July 17, 1864, they addressed a note to the Confederate Secretary of State, Benjamin, asking an interview with President Davis. "They visit Richmond," they wrote, "only as private citizens and have no official character or authority, but they are acquainted with the views of the United States government and with the sentiments of the Northern people relative to an adjustment of the differences existing between the North and the South, and earnestly hope that a free interchange of views between President Davis and themselves may open the way to such official negotiations as will result in restoring peace to the two sections of our distracted country." Upon this, they were invited to Mr. Benjamin's office, and thoroughly cross-questioned to ascertain whether Mr. Lincoln in any way authorized their coming, to which they replied emphatically and truthfully in the negative. Finally, the desired interview was arranged, and at 9 o'clock that night, Jefferson Davis and Mr. Benjamin, his Secretary of State, gave them an audience in the same room. The self-constituted envoys reported on their return that Mr. Davis received them politely, and favored them with a 2 hours' discussion. Only so much of their report need be quoted as indicates the plan of adjustment which their imagination had devised, and which was as visionary as might be expected from the joint effort of a preacher and a novelist. It is hardly necessary to repeat that Mr. Lincoln had not thought of nor hinted at any such scheme to Mr. Gilmore, and that he would not and could not have accepted it, even if it had been agreed to or offered by the rebels. The essential part of the discussion is thus stated. Envoys. If I understand you, the dispute between your government and ours is narrowed down to this: union or disunion. Davis. Yes, or to put it in other words, independence or subjugation. Envoys. Suppose the two governments should agree to something like this: to go to the people with two propositions, say, peace with disunion and Southern independence as your proposition, and peace with union, emancipation, no confiscation, and universal amnesty as ours. Let the citizens of all the United States, as they existed before the war, vote yes or no on these two propositions at a special election within 60 days. If a majority votes disunion, our government to be bound by it and to let you go in peace. If a majority votes union, yours to be bound by it and to stay in peace. The two governments can contract in this way, and the people, though constitutionally unable to decide on peace or war, can elect which of the two propositions shall govern their rulers. Let Lee and Grant, meanwhile, agree to an armistice. This would sheathe the sword, and if once sheathed it would never again be drawn by this generation. Davis. The plan is altogether impracticable. If the South were only one state it might work, but as it is, if one Southern state objected to emancipation, it would nullify the whole thing. For you are aware the people of Virginia cannot vote slavery out of South Carolina, nor the people of South Carolina voted out of Virginia. Envoys. But 3/4 of the states can amend the Constitution. Let it be done in that way, in any way, so that it be done by the people. I am not a statesman or a politician, and I do not know just how such a plan could be carried out, but you get the idea that the people shall decide the question. Davis. That the majority shall decide it, you mean. We seceded to rid ourselves of the rule of the majority, and this would subject us to it again. Envoys. But the majority must rule finally, either with bullets or ballots. Davis. I am not so sure of that. Neither current events nor history shows that the majority rules or ever did rule. The contrary, I think, is true. Why, sir, the man who should go before the Southern people with such a proposition, with any proposition which implied that the North was to have a voice in determining the domestic relations of the South, could not live here a day. He would be hanged to the first tree without judge or jury. Envoys. But seriously, sir, you let the majority rule in a single state, why not let it rule in the whole country? Davis. Because the states are independent and sovereign, the country is not. It is only a confederation of states, or rather it was. It is now 2 confederations. Benjamin. But tell me, are the terms you have named, emancipation, no confiscation, and universal amnesty, the terms which Mr. Lincoln authorized you to offer us? Envoys. No, sir. Mr. Lincoln did not authorize me to offer you any terms, but I think both he and the Northern people, for the sake of peace, would assent to some such conditions. Davis. But amnesty, sir, applies to criminals. We have committed no crime. Confiscation is of no account unless you can enforce it. And emancipation? You have already emancipated nearly 2 millions of our slaves, and if you will take care of them, you may emancipate the rest. I had a few when the war began. I was of some use to them. They were never of any use to me. Against their will you emancipated them, and you may emancipate every Negro in the Confederacy, but we will be free. We will govern ourselves. We will do it if we have to see every Southern plantation sacked and every Southern city in flames. Say to Mr. Lincoln, from me, that I shall at any time be pleased to receive proposals for peace on the basis of our independence. It will be useless to approach me with any other. The envoys were as fortunate in getting quickly out of the rebel lines as they had been in getting in, and soon after their return Mr. Gilmore published a long account of the interview, from which the foregoing extracts are made. That it was substantially correct is shown by comparing it with the account written out and sent to the diplomatic agents of the Confederacy in Europe by Mr. Benjamin. He makes an issue of veracity on a minor point, alleging that Mr. Gilmore and Colonel Jaquess stated that they came with the knowledge and at the desire of President Lincoln, and were prepared to make proposals by his authority, an allegation directly contradicted by their letter asking the interview. But, on the question of terms of adjustment, there is no material variance as to what was proposed on the one hand or declared on the other. Jefferson Davis haughtily charges the envoys with impudence and ignorance, but admits in the same breath that he condescendingly explained to them his views of their proposal and the nature and powers of the Confederate government. On the whole, this volunteer embassy was of service to the Union cause. In the pending presidential campaign, the mouths of the peace factionists were to a great extent stopped by the renewed declaration of the chief rebel that he would fight for separation to the bitter end. The peace negotiations at Niagara Falls and at Richmond, which in a fragmentary way were immediately noticed and commented upon by the newspapers, met a quick and sensitive public interest and directed special inquiry to President Lincoln himself. Every one whose political or personal standing warranted it was desirous of ascertaining the truth at first hand. How the President felt and talked upon this topic is best shown by a letter written to a personal friend in New York at the time. I feel that the subject which you pressed upon my attention in our recent conversation is an important one. The men of the South recently, and perhaps still, at Niagara Falls, tell us distinctly that they are in the confidential employment of the rebellion, and they tell us as distinctly that they are not empowered to offer terms of peace. Does anyone doubt that what they are empowered to do is to assist in selecting and arranging a candidate and a platform for the Chicago Convention? Who could have given them this confidential employment but he who, only a week since, declared to Jaquess and Gilmore that he had no terms of peace but the independence of the South, the dissolution of the Union? Thus, the present presidential contest will almost certainly be no other than a contest between a Union and a disunion candidate, disunion certainly following the success of the latter. The issue is a mighty one for all people and all times, and whoever aids the right will be appreciated and remembered. This letter, written to a Republican politician, needed no argument to enforce its conclusions. But there was another class of questioners who, in this new and rapid development of war and politics, came to the President with more searching and far-reaching inquiries. Thus, the editor of a war Democratic newspaper in Wisconsin wrote to say that he had hitherto sustained the President's emancipation policy on the argument that it deprived the South of its laborers and thus undermined the strength of the rebellion. The Niagara Falls peace movement, he continued, was of no importance whatever, except that it resulted in bringing out your declaration, as we understand it, that no steps can be taken towards peace from any quarter unless accompanied with an abandonment of slavery. This puts the whole war question on a new basis, and takes us war Democrats clear off our feet, leaving us no ground to stand upon. If we sustain the war and war policy, does it not demand the changing of our party politics? I venture to write you this letter, then, not for the purpose of finding fault with your policy, for that you have a right to fix upon without consulting any of us, but in the hope that you may suggest some interpretation of it, as well as make it tenable ground on which we war Democrats might stand, preserve our party consistency, support the government, and continue to carry also to its support those large numbers of our old political friends who have stood by us up to this time. In reply to him, Mr. Lincoln drafted a letter of considerable length, which, though apparently unfinished and probably never sent, is of the highest interest. Your letter of the 7th was placed in my hand yesterday by Governor Randall. To me it seems plain that saying reunion and abandonment of slavery would be considered, if offered, is not saying that nothing else or less would be considered, if offered. But I will not stand upon the mere construction of language. It is true, as you remind me, that in the Greeley letter of 1862 I said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I continued in the same letter as follows: what I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause. All this I said in the utmost sincerity, and I am as true to the whole of it now as when I first said it. When I afterwards proclaimed emancipation and employed colored soldiers, I only followed the declaration just quoted from the Greeley letter that I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause. The way these measures were to help the cause was not to be by magic or miracles, but by inducing the colored people to come bodily over from the rebel side to ours. On this point, nearly a year ago, in a letter to Mr. Conkling, made public at once, I wrote as follows: "But Negroes, like other people, act upon motives. Why should they do anything for us if we will do nothing for them? If they stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motives, even the promise of freedom. And the promise being made must be kept. I am sure you will not, on due reflection, say that the promise being made must be broken at the first opportunity. I am sure you would not desire me to say, or to leave an inference, that I am ready, whenever convenient, to join in re-enslaving those who shall have served us in consideration of our promise. As matter of morals, could any such treachery by any possibility escape the curses of heaven, or of any good man? As a matter of policy, to announce such a purpose would ruin the Union cause itself. All recruiting of colored men would instantly cease, and all colored men now in our service would instantly desert us. And rightfully, too. Why should they give our lives for us, with full notice of our purpose to betray them? Drive back to the support of the rebellion the physical force which the colored people now give and promise us, and neither the present nor any coming administration can save the Union. Take from us and give to the enemy the 130, 40, or 50,000 colored persons now serving us as soldiers, seamen, and laborers, and we cannot longer maintain the contest. The party who could elect a president on a war and slavery restoration platform would of necessity lose the colored force, and that force being lost would be as powerless to save the Union as to do any other impossible thing. It is not a question of sentiment or taste, but one of physical force, which may be measured and estimated as horsepower and steam power are measured and estimated, and by measurement it is more than we can lose and live. Nor can we, by discarding it, get a white force in place of it. There is a witness in every white man's bosom that he would rather go to the war having the Negro to help him than to help the enemy against him. It is not the giving of one class for another. It is simply giving a large force to the enemy for nothing in return. In addition to what I have said, allow me to remind you that no one, having control of the rebel armies, or, in fact, having any influence whatever in the rebellion, has offered or intimated a willingness to a restoration of the Union in any event or on any condition whatever. Let it be constantly borne in mind that no such offer has been made or intimated. Shall we be weak enough to allow the enemy to distract us with an abstract question which he himself refuses to present as a practical one? In the Conkling letter before mentioned, I said, "Whenever you shall have conquered all resistance to the Union, if I shall urge you to continue fighting, it will be an apt time then to declare that you will not fight to free Negroes." I repeat this now. If Jefferson Davis wishes for himself, or for the benefit of his friends at the North, to know what I would do if he were to offer peace and reunion, saying nothing about slavery, let him try me. But the President was not yet at the end of his annoyances from this unreasonable and abnormal craving for peace negotiations, which had infected some individuals of otherwise cool judgment. The party anxiety of certain Republican leaders had at this juncture become unusually sensitive. The Democratic National Convention was about to meet in the city of Chicago, and the nomination of McClellan as its candidate was strongly foreshadowed. In anticipation, Democratic leaders, newspapers, and delegates were especially active and boastful. Their unwonted confidence and bold prophecies created general uneasiness among Republicans, and in a few instances produced a downright panic. Under this feeling, the National Executive Committee of the Republican Party met in New York for consultation, and so, on the 22nd of August, its chairman, Henry J. Raymond, wrote the President the following extraordinary letter. I feel compelled to drop you a line concerning the political condition of the country as it strikes me. I am in active correspondence with your staunchest friends in every state, and from them all I hear but one report. The tide is setting strongly against us. Honorable E.B. Washburne writes that, were there an election to be held now in Illinois, we should be beaten. Mr. Cameron writes that Pennsylvania is against us. Governor Morton writes that nothing but the most strenuous efforts can carry Indiana. This state, according to the best information I can get, would go 50,000 against us tomorrow. And so of the rest. Nothing but the most resolute and decided action on the part of the government and its friends can save the country from falling into hostile hands. Two special causes are assigned for this great reaction in public sentiment: the want of military successes, and the impression in some minds, the fear and suspicion in others, that we are not to have peace in any event under this administration until slavery is abandoned. In some way or other, the suspicion is widely diffused that we can have peace with Union if we would. It is idle to reason with this belief, still more idle to denounce it. It can only be expelled by some authoritative act, at once bold enough to fix attention and distinct enough to defy incredulity and challenge respect. Why would it not be wise, under these circumstances, to appoint a commission in due form to make distinct proffers of peace to Davis, as the head of the rebel armies, on the sole condition of acknowledging the supremacy of the Constitution, all other questions to be settled in a convention of the people of all the states? The making of such an offer would require no armistice, no suspension of active war, no abandonment of positions, no sacrifice of consistency. If the proffer were accepted, which I presume it would not be, the country would never consent to place the practical execution of its details in any but loyal hands, and in those we should be safe. If it should be rejected, as it would be, it would plant seeds of disaffection in the South, dispel all the delusions about peace that prevail in the North, silence the clamors and damaging falsehoods of the opposition, take the wind completely out of the sails of the Chicago craft, reconcile public sentiment to the war, the draft, and the tax as inevitable necessities, and unite the North as nothing since the firing on Fort Sumter has hitherto done. I cannot conceive of any answer which Davis could give to such a proposition which would not strengthen you and the Union cause everywhere. Even your radical friends could not fail to applaud it when they should see the practical strength it would bring to the common cause. I beg you to excuse the earnestness with which I have pressed this matter upon your attention. It seems to me calculated to do good, and incapable of doing harm. It will turn the tide of public sentiment, and avert impending evils of the gravest character. It will arouse and concentrate the loyalty of the country, and unless I am greatly mistaken, give us an easy and a fruitful victory. Permit me to add, that if done at all, I think this should be done at once, as your own spontaneous act. In advance of the Chicago Convention, it might render the action of that body of very little consequence. 3 days later, Raymond and his committee, in obvious desperation and panic, came to Washington personally to urge these views upon the President. To any calm judgment, and in the light of Greeley's Niagara mission and Jaquess's Richmond mission and their results, the proposition of Raymond was entirely inadmissible. But Mr. Lincoln felt that this advice, coming from the chairman of the Executive National Committee of the political party of which he was the presidential candidate, demanded patient hearing and respectful answer. He likewise resolved that if he were forced to such a step, he would, as he had done in the case of both Greeley and Jaquess, again make the proposer of the project the witness of its absurdity. To facilitate examination and discussion of the question, he therefore wrote, with his own hand, the following experimental draft of instructions, with which, to give point to his argument, he proposed to send Raymond to the rebel authorities. Executive Mansion, Washington, August 24, 1864. Sir, you will proceed forthwith and obtain, if possible, a conference for peace with Honorable Jefferson Davis, or any person by him authorized for that purpose. You will address him in entirely respectful terms, at all events, and in any that may be indispensable to secure the conference. At said conference you will propose, on behalf of this government, that upon the restoration of the Union and the national authority, the war shall cease at once, all remaining questions to be left for adjustment by peaceful modes. If this be accepted, hostilities to cease at once. If it be not accepted, you will then request to be informed what terms, if any, embracing the restoration of the Union, would be accepted. If any such be presented to you in answer, you will forthwith report the same to this government and await further instructions. If the presentation of any terms embracing the restoration of the Union be declined, you will then request to be informed what terms of peace would be accepted, and on receiving any answer, report the same to this government and await further instructions. A quotation from the private memoranda of an inmate of the Executive Mansion, made at the time, gives us the conclusion of the incident. The President and the stronger half of the Cabinet, Seward, Stanton, and Fessenden, held a consultation with him, Raymond, and showed him that they had thoroughly considered and discussed the proposition of his letter of the 22nd, and on giving him their reasons he very readily concurred with them in the opinion that to follow his plan of sending a commission to Richmond would be worse than losing the presidential contest. It would be ignominiously surrendering it in advance. Nevertheless, the visit of himself and committee here did great good. They found the President and Cabinet much better informed than themselves, and went home encouraged and cheered. Events, political and military, which occurred and came to public knowledge very few days afterwards, silenced the preposterous clamor of peace fanatics, and the manuscript of Lincoln's experimental letter thereafter slept undisturbed in the envelope in which he placed it for nearly a quarter of a century. End of chapter 9.